Okay.
But anyways, the first 2 or 3 weeks were, the first week we talked about the megaliths and the beginning of the calculation of time and how they laid out rocks and mapped the constellations and how they moved across the sky. And that was the original calendar. Monoliths like Stonehenge and different ones that we showed you. And then we got into some calculated calendars of men. From the earliest calendars up until today's teaching, which is going to be on the Babylonian calendar, leading into the Hillel II calendar. Now, before I go any further, I need to tell you that there are numerous other calendars out there that pretty much coincide with the calendars that we've already talked about. The reason I chose the calendars that I chose during this teaching is because we can use those calendars to see where all of these other calendars that are making their way into the Messianic movement come from. And the way they come about is they draw a portion from this calendar, and they draw a portion from this calendar, and they draw a portion from this calendar, and then try to compile it and try to build their own calendar out of that. We've all heard about all the different calendars, whether it's lunar Sabbath, the conjunction, the Enochian calendar, the spring equinox calendar, the fall equinox calendar. When do we begin our count? How do we begin our count? We've all heard that stuff through this movement probably since you've been here, because it's something that we want to figure out. It's something that we need to figure out about how to be on Yahweh's timeline. Because we don't want to rely on man's calculations. We want to rely on the Father alone to direct our path in everything that we do, including our time. So, as we start talking about the Babylonian calendar, it's going to be pretty tedious. We're going to go into some detail, give you some names that aren't really going to mean anything to you. But I'm giving them to you as research material. Because if I gave you every bit of the research material, then we would be here a year or two going over nothing but the calendar. We're going to try to wrap this up in 5 or 6 weeks. So last week we talked about a few calendars leading into the Babylonian calendar. Now this week we're going to focus solely on the Babylonian calendar leading into the Hillel II calendar. Hopefully we'll wrap up most of the Hillel II calendar, but we'll see that reappear as we start next week's teaching. Because this is the calendar that most Jews in the world are on. But we need to know how it came about. We need to know why it was attributed to Hillel, because when you really know the history of it, Hillel really didn't have a fixed set of time, but they attribute the calendar to him as well. So you'll need other research material to prove those things out, but for the sake of argument, we're going to call it the Hillel II calendar. The Babylonian calendar was a lunar solar calendar with years consisting of 12 months, each beginning when a new crescent moon was first sighted low in the western horizon at sunset. Anybody know what calendar resembles that? The biblical calendar, right? We cite the new moon every month as it's low in the western sky. We see it as it starts to go behind the horizon. We declare that to be the beginning of the new month. Now there's arguments out there saying that, well, we shouldn't even be sighting the crescent, we should be going off the conjunction at the very exact moment that the moon stops its waning process and starts its waxing process. I've never been able to sight a moon that I couldn't see. Just been an impossibility for me. And also, we didn't have the U.S. observatory, thousands of years ago, that would declare when the exact moment of the conjunction was. So
They didn't have that app on their phone.
yeah, we didn't have that app on our phone 2,000 years ago. So it's kind of hard to figure that out. I mean, I can teach that calendar just as good as any person who's teaching it out there right now, and I can explain to you how to calculate a conjunction. But even the best calculation of the conjunction will leave you off hours and hours. So how do we declare? We can look at historical reference, and all I'm going to say concerning that further until we get, and you'll hear this again in the later teaching, but when Yeshua was here, you're actually probably going to hear this same statement numerous times in this teaching. We have first-hand account information, historical documentation that when Yeshua was here, we were on a 7-day Sabbath, and we were sighting the first crescent of the moon to establish our months. And when we read the Brit Hadashah, you cannot find one place, not one place. Now we see Yeshua rebuking the rabbis for everything, from washing their hands to trying to usurp authority, for making his house a den of thieves. We see him rebuking them over and over and over again for various reasons. You know what we don't see him ever rebuking them for? He don't rebuke them for the Sabbath that they're keeping, and he doesn't rebuke them for the new moons that they're keeping. Now I want you to get in your mind how important the Sabbath and the new moons are.
Especially to him.
Especially to him. They're one of the most important things to him. So do you think the Messiah, the Son of Elohim, would come here and celebrate on a false Sabbath? Would celebrate false new moons? No, he wouldn't. He would bring correction to that area because they would be doing it against the way the Father commanded us to do it. But we never see him rebuke anybody.
Just like the money changers.
Exactly. So when we come to that understanding, you can read. Let's see, what's his name? I have his book next to it. Philo. Philo, who was a contemporary of Yeshua. He knew Yeshua. He knew the followers of Yeshua. He knew the Sabbath they were keeping. He knew how they were observing the new moons. He says in his book clearly that during that day and time that the Sanhedrin would send out new moon spotters upon the mountains of Jerusalem, and that they would spot the new moon. And it took at least 2 witnesses that had seen the moon for it to be declared a new month. Now, why would you send people out to sight a moon that is not in the sky? That doesn't make sense, does it? So now we see the Babylonian calendar. Way back when we were in Babylon, we see the Babylonian calendar, their months began when? When they sighted the first crescent. Now, another little bit of historical reference for you. Pre-Babylonian calendar, which we talked about last week, they were going off of some agricultural type calendar. But then they take Israel into captivity. When they take Israel into captivity, now all of a sudden their calendar adjusts itself. Why? Because they saw the nation of Israel keeping Yahweh's calendar. And because they kept his calendar, they were blessed. Their crops grew. They flourished. They were abundant. So if you have land here and I have land here, we're getting the same rain, we have the same soil, and your crop's growing and my crop's not, I'm going to say, hey, what are you doing to get that crop to grow like that? So the Babylonians began to realize that following Yahweh's appointed times helped your crops grow. So they adjusted their calendars to that. So now they're relying more on the sighting of the new moon for their agricultural cycle. Their solar cycle, of course, they're still going off of the Babylonian solar cycle. But now we see the observance of the new moon pop up in the Babylonian calendar. Plus an intercalary month inserted as needed by decree. The calendar is based on a Sumerian 3rd dynasty of predecessor preserved in the Ummah calendar of Shaligi, 21st century BC. So we talked about the Sumerian calendar. We know how they did it. Again, captivity. They saw how the Jews were being blessed. They started adjusting their calendar. So the Babylonian calendar was also based on the Sumerian calendar. What they're not going to do, what history is not going to do, is give the Jews or Israel credit for anything. Do you know that? In fact, right now they're trying to say that Israel was never even taken into captivity into Egypt. We were never there. We didn't build them pyramids. We didn't do any of that stuff. That's all made up fantasy history propagated by the evil Jews. They're trying to rewrite history. We know that not to be true because we see the biblical evidence of Jews being there, if nothing else, in the calendars. How come every society was on a different calendar, and then when they take the Israelites into captivity, their calendar morphs? That's pretty amazing, huh? And now their calendar begins to line up to the Word, to the biblical calendar, more than the calendar that they were on previously. So, historical evidence is, yes, the Jews were taken captivity. The year begins in spring. What other calendar begins in spring? The biblical calendar, right? Doesn't begin in winter, does it? Doesn't begin January 1st. It begins in the spring. And is divided into Resasadi, beginning, and Misel-Sadi, the middle, and Quit-Sadi, end of the year. The word for month is Arua, construct of Ara, the chief deity of the Assyrians. Remember us talking about the Assyrian calendar? The Sumerian calendar, the Assyrian calendar? We all talked about that last week. So, they're basing their calendars off of other calendars of nations who they see being blessed. Is assigned the surplus in this early month, showing that the calendar originates in Babylonian and not later Assyrian times. During the 6th century BC Babylonian captivity of the Hebrews, the Babylonian month names were adopted into the Hebrew calendar. Now, here's where you want to focus. They didn't tell you that part of this calendar came from the Hebrews, did they? The only point they're making about the Hebrews here is that we now took on the names of months that they have named after their false gods. Right? So, showing us that they convinced us to go against Scripture because we're not supposed to have the names of the false god on our lips. We're not supposed to speak those things. Jeremiah said, I would that my lips could be clean. Because in everyday speech, his lips were unclean by saying the names of the days of the week, by saying the names of the month. If somebody asked him what time it was, he had to use a reference that everybody was familiar with. So even in telling you what time of year it was, he was making his lips unclean. The Babylonian month names were adopted into the Hebrew calendar. The Assyrian calendar used in Iraq and the Levant also uses many of the same names for its months, such as Iyar, Tammuz, Ab, Elul, Tishri, and Adar. Israel has no record of naming months until their Babylonian captivity. Does everybody hear that? There is no historical reference for Israel ever naming a month. It was, we had 2 months that or 1 month that we actually heard from the Father, and he didn't really name it. He just said, this is the month of the Aviv, Ha'aviv. Okay? So the name of the month is not Aviv. It's just the month that we see things becoming green and end the year. Okay? That is the beginning, month 1, to you. So even in that sense, we never named a month. Yahweh never named a month. It was month 1, month 2, month 3, month 4, or Hadosh 1, Hadosh 2, Hadosh 3, Hadosh 4, so on and so forth until we come to the end of the year, because we relied solely on his calculations, not on man's. But when we went into the Babylonian captivity, we took on a Babylonian nature. The same way today we as Jews have taken on a Greek nature. Whoever is the ruling power of the world, that's whose nature we take on. So now, most Jews, even though we say we're following Hillel II calendar, what is a Hillel II calendar based on? The Gregorian calendar, right? Lines up perfectly with the Gregorian calendar. The only thing that Hillel did was change the intercalary month and stated what days the feast days were going to be on, because he wanted to keep the feast days in order, so during the diaspora we could all be on the same feast days. The months of the year are not named in Scripture except for the first month, the month of the Aviv, prior to Babylonian captivity. Now, after Babylonian captivity, when you read Scripture, you see a lot of these Babylonian month names creep into Scripture. Did Yahweh name them? Did he tell us to name them? But we start seeing those names creep into Scripture, the majority of them being found in the book of Esther. Ha'aviv, Nisan. Nisan is the Babylonian name. Ha'aviv is the name we see in Scripture, right? Esther 3:7. Ha'aviv, Exodus 12:2, and Exodus 13:4 in English Scripture calls it Aviv. Ha'aviv, the month of the Aviv. So that's the only one that we see the Father himself actually naming. This month, the month of the Aviv, will be the beginning of months unto you. But Esther calls it the month of Nisan, after the Babylonian captivity, right? Ziv, King 6:1 calls it Ziv, not called Iyar as Judaism states. Iyar comes with the Babylonian captivity, right? The Assyrian captivity. Sivan, Esther 8:9. The fourth month has no name to be found in Scripture, still. The fifth month has no name in Scripture to be found, still. The sixth month is the month of Elul, is the name of the Elul is the name of the sixth month. Elul seems like it is the name of the sixth month by 2 verses below. Nehemiah 6:15. So the wall was finished in the 20th and 5th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. Okay? So we see that, right? Captivity, the Assyrian captivity, we see those names start creeping in, right? Where was Esther captive at? Syria, right? Nehemiah 7:73. So the priests and the Levites and the porters and the singers and some of the people and the Nethinims and all Israel dwelt in their cities. And when the 7th month came, the children of Israel were in their cities.
Hello?
The 7th month is Ha-Ethim. 1 Kings 8:2 calls it Ethanim. Tishri is the wrong name as Judaism states. Okay, again, Judaism isn't wrong because they're going off the Babylonian captivity. Esther, and at this time when Kings was written, we were in the Syrian captivity. So we were going off of the Syrian names, right? The Assyrian names. Bull. 1 Kings 8:38. In English, Scripture calls it Bull, not called Chavan, nor Marchavan, as Judaism states. Again, the same argument there. This was named after the Assyrian captivity, not after the Babylonian captivity. Cheslev, Zechariah 7:1. In English, Scripture calls it Cheslu. Tevith, Esther 2:6. In English, Scripture calls it Tebeth. The 11th month is Shevat, Zechariah 1:7. In English, Scripture calls it Sebat. Sebat. What does Sebat sound like? Shabbat, right? Another teaching for another time. The 12th month is the month of Adar, Esther 3:7. But then we have an intercalary month that gets inserted every so often called Adar 2. These are the Babylonian calendar months. Ara Nasinu, Ara Aru, Ara Simrinu, Ara Demuzu, Ara Abu, Ara Alulu, Ara Tishtunum, Ara Samnu, Ara Kislemun, Ara Tebetum, Ara Sabatum, Ara Aduru, Adar, Ara Makarasa, Adari, second month, Adar 2, Adar Bet. On the Hillel II calendar, the names of the month is Nisan, Iyar, Savan, Tammuz, Ab, Elul, Tishri, Chesvan, Kislev, Tebet, Shevat, Adar, and Adar 2. Until the 5th century BC, the calendar was fully observational. But beginning about 499 BC, the months began to be regulated by a lunar solar cycle of 19 years, equaling 235 months, although usually called the Metonic cycle. Okay? Now, we're not going to go into great detail with the Metonic cycle. But basically every 19 years, they would, at some point in that 19 years, they would insert the intercalary month. They would insert Adar Bet, the Adar Bet. After no more than 3 isolated exceptions, by 380 BC, the months of the calendar were regulated by the cycle without exception. So they think that maybe 3 19-year cycles were off here and there. But after 380 BC, they say that the cycle was always put exactly in a fixed place. In the cycle of 19 years, the month Adar 2 was intercalculated, except in the year that was number 17 in the cycle, when the month Elul 2 was inserted. During this period, the first day of each month, beginning at sunset. When does the day begin? You think they made that up on their own? Because we, as Bible believers, we realize the Father said, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And the evening and the morning were the third day, and so on and so forth. So our calendar always began in the evening. But to somebody who didn't know Yahweh, when would you think that their day began? At sunrise, right? At sunrise. But now, we've compromised, and our day doesn't begin at sunset, and it doesn't begin at sunrise. It begins at some imaginary point in the middle of the night we call midnight. Man's calculations versus Yahweh's ordained reckoning of time. Continued to be the day when the new moon was first sighted. The calendar never used a specific or a specified number of days in any month. That's a good principle. We should never use a specified number of days in a month. In week 1 of this teaching, we broke it down that a day is not actually 24 hours. That a year is not actually 365 days. That a month is not actually 29.5 days. We did all the correct math on those things, showing that clearly something was amiss. But now we look at this, and 1 month we'll see the new moon, the crescent moon, on the 29th day of the month, which makes it the first day of the month, right? Once we see that new crescent, that begins the first day of the month. Okay? But the next month, we might not see it until the 30th day. And on the very rare occasion, the 31st day. So we calculate that, and when you do the calculation on man's calendar, it works out to about 29.5 days a month.
Hello?
Can you have half a day? No. You can't have a half a day. Tablets from the 6th century BC reign of Cyrus. Now, we just got done talking about Trump before we started teaching. Anybody heard the argument that Trump is operating as King Cyrus did? Okay. That's a good study. If you haven't studied that, you need to study it out and find those similarities, because there's nothing that has been before that will not be again. That's what Scripture says. So we see that clear picture. Cyrus the Great and Cambius II indicate these dates were sometimes approximate. The lunation, or the lunar cycle, of 29 or 30 days basically contained 3 7-day weeks, and a final week of 8 or 9 days inclusive, breaking the continuous 7-day cycle. Where in Scripture can we find that we have the right or the ability to break the 7-day cycle? We don't, right? So every 7 days, because the days of the week are not calculated according to the rest of the feast cycle. They're calculated as 7 yoms. Okay? So we don't have the right or the ability to break that. But that's where we get a lot of this lunar Sabbath calendar teaching from. At the end of the month, it's a 9 or a 10-day week. Your Sabbath doesn't begin again until you see that first crescent again. Doesn't make sense to me. Can't find it anywhere in Scripture, but they'll tell you that's how it is. Shabbat on the Babylonian calendar. Among other theories of Shabbat origin, the Universal Jewish Encyclopedia of Isaac Lehman advanced the theory that Assyriologists like Frederick Delitzsch, the Shabbat originally arose from the lunar cycle containing 4 weeks ending in Sabbath, plus 1 or 2 additional reckoned days per month. So now you had 4 weeks, 4 7-day Sabbaths, but then ever so often you had to add a couple days. Same principle. It's the same thing that the lunar Sabbath is trying to do now. This all comes back to the Babylonian calendar. We don't want to be on a Babylonian calendar. We don't want to be on man's calculations. We want to be on the Father's reckoning of time. The difficulties of this theory include reconciling the differences between an unbroken week and a lunar week, and explaining the absence of text naming the lunar week as Shabbat in any language. Did you hear that? You can't find a lunar week in any text, in any language, historically. So why do we have people in this movement that are going around propagating that we have to go off of the lunar Sabbath? When you see the first crescent, that's a Sabbath. When you see the first quarter moon, that's a Sabbath. When you see the full moon, that's a Sabbath. When you see the final quarter, that's a Sabbath. And then you wait your however many extra days until you see the first crescent again, that's a Sabbath. It doesn't hold water, does it? When we start really looking into it and looking into the origins of where it came from. The rarely attested Sabtu and Sabbatu as the full moon is cognate or merged with Hebrew Shabbat, but the monthly rather than the weekly. It is regarded as a form of Sumerian Sabbat, mid-rest, attested in Akkadian as Num Levi, the day of mid-repose. Okay? So how many's heard about the calendar that's now creeping into the Messianic movement, where the moon doesn't the month doesn't begin until the full moon? You see where that comes from? Again, it comes from the Babylonian calendar. We don't go off of a Babylonian calendar. We can't rely on man's calculations. I'm going to state that 1,000,000 times during this teaching. According to Marcello Cravai, Sabbath was almost certainly derived from the Babylonian Sabbatu, the festival of the full moon. But all trace of any such origin having been lost, the Hebrews ascribed it to biblical legend. Now, did you hear that mess? So we didn't even, they're making the case that we never even had a Sabbath until we went into captivity into Babylon. And only when we came out of Babylon did we start observing the Sabbath. Can we prove that wrong with Scripture?
So basically saying the book of Genesis and all that never existed until after Babylon?
Had we gone into captivity when we came out of Egypt?
No.
We hadn't gone into Babylonian captivity then, had we? Did we have a Sabbath then?
Yes.
So much so that we were commanded to stay in our tents. So much so that we were commanded to gather manna for 6 days a week, and on the seventh day to rest. So where did the Sabbath originate? Did it originate in Babylon, or did it originate in Genesis chapter 2? It originated in Genesis chapter 2 for us as a people. The Babylonian calendar adopted Sabbatu from us when we went into captivity. It's exactly the reverse of what history is trying to teach us. The conclusion is a contextual restoration of the damaged and